In the soft glow of streetlights across Brooklyn's aging brick buildings, the night often felt quieter than it truly was. Beneath that calm surface lived a different rhythm, one shaped by whispers, loyalties, and rules that never appeared in any law book. It was a world where reputation mattered more than comfort, and silence could protect a man better than any weapon. This was the environment that slowly shaped Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, long before his name carried meaning inside the hidden corridors of organized crime. He was not born into power, nor into wealth. His beginnings were modest, wrapped in the everyday struggles of immigrant neighborhoods where families worked long hours and children learned early that survival depended on toughness. The streets taught lessons schools never could. Respect had to be earned. Weakness was remembered. And loyalty, real loyalty, was rare enough to become a kind of currency. From an early age, Benjamin showed a quiet intensity. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the most physically imposing figure on the block. But he watched everything. He listened carefully. People often underestimated men who stayed silent, and that misunderstanding gave him an advantage he would carry for the rest of his life. The neighborhood itself functioned like a small, unwritten system of order. Certain corners belonged to certain crews. Certain businesses paid for protection whether they admitted it or not. Older men sat outside social clubs, speaking in low tones that younger boys pretended not to hear. Nothing was officially explained, yet everyone understood the boundaries. Crossing those invisible lines could change a life in an instant. Benjamin grew up surrounded by stories, some exaggerated, some painfully real, about men who rose quickly and disappeared just as fast. Prison sentences were spoken about the way other families discussed long trips away from home. Funerals arrived too early and too often. Yet alongside the danger existed a strange sense of belonging. For boys searching for identity, the pull of that world could feel stronger than fear. Work was always available, but honest work rarely offered dignity in the way young men imagined it should. Long hours in small shops or construction sites brought exhaustion without recognition. Meanwhile, the figures connected to the underground economy appeared respected, well-dressed, and protected by an aura of untouchable confidence. To an outsider, it looked like success. To those inside, it was something far more complicated. Benjamin didn't rush toward that life. His path unfolded slowly, shaped by relationships more than ambition. He formed bonds with men who valued discipline and secrecy. Conversations happened in back rooms, in parked cars, or during quiet walks after midnight. Nothing important was ever written down. Memory served as the only record. What stood out most about him was consistency. He showed up when asked. He followed instructions precisely. He avoided unnecessary attention. In a world where unpredictability often led to disaster, reliability became his defining trait. Older figures noticed. Trust once given opened doors that could never be forced. Yet beneath the surface, tension always existed. Law enforcement pressure was growing across New York. Investigations were becoming more sophisticated. Surveillance replaced guesswork. Informants, once rare, were becoming a constant fear. The old belief that silence guaranteed safety was beginning to weaken, though many refused to admit it. Benjamin remained committed to the code he had absorbed since childhood. Loyalty meant endurance. It meant sacrifice without complaint. It meant standing firm, even when circumstances turned cold. These values earned admiration inside certain circles, but they also carried a hidden cost. The deeper a man stepped into that world, the harder it became to step back out. Moments of normal life still appeared: family dinners, laughter with friends, quiet afternoons untouched by danger. Those glimpses reminded him of what existed beyond the shadows. But each passing year made the distance between those two realities wider. Choices, once small, became permanent. What no one fully understood at the time was how dramatically the landscape of organized crime would change in the coming decades. The era of quiet operations and predictable hierarchies was nearing a turning point. Federal prosecutions, internal betrayals, and shifting loyalties would soon reshape everything men like Benjamin believed was unbreakable. For now, though, the streets still looked calm. Conversations still happened behind closed doors, and a quiet, disciplined man continued moving carefully through a world built on trust that could vanish overnight. His story was not one of sudden rise or dramatic ambition. It was the slow construction of identity inside a system that rewarded obedience more than dreams. Every step forward carried unseen consequences. Every promise carried weight, and every act of loyalty moved him closer to a future he could not yet see. In neighborhoods like Brooklyn during those years, destiny rarely arrived with warning. It formed gradually, shaped by environment, expectation, and the powerful desire to belong somewhere permanent. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was becoming part of something larger than himself, something that offered respect, protection, and purpose, while quietly demanding everything in return. The silence around him felt peaceful, but it was the kind of peace that exists just before a storm begins to gather. And the storm was already on its way. In neighborhoods where reputation carried more weight than opportunity, movement into the hidden structure of organized crime rarely happened with ceremony. There were no announcements, no official invitations, and certainly no written agreements. Advancement unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, revealed only through subtle changes in how others spoke, listened, and made space. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the shift began not with a single moment, but with a gradual recognition that he was no longer standing on the outside. By the time he reached early adulthood, the rhythm of the streets had already shaped his instincts. He understood when to speak, and when silence carried more meaning. He recognized tension before voices rose. Most importantly, he knew that trust inside this world was not granted through charm or ambition, but through steady, predictable loyalty proven over time. Men who tried too hard were viewed with suspicion. Men who stayed patient often moved forward, without appearing to try at all. Small responsibilities arrived first. Delivering messages that could not be spoken over telephones, watching entrances during private meetings, carrying envelopes whose contents were never discussed. None of these tasks looked significant to an outsider, yet each one functioned as a quiet test. Reliability mattered more than speed. Discretion mattered more than curiosity. Completing simple duties without mistakes created a reputation stronger than any introduction. The social clubs scattered across Brooklyn served as informal centers of gravity for this hidden network. During daylight hours, they looked ordinary places where older men drank coffee, argued about sports, and passed time. At night, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations softened. Strangers were noticed immediately. Decisions affecting entire crews could be made in voices barely louder than a whisper. Inside these rooms, hierarchy was understood without being explained. Benjamin spent increasing amounts of time near these spaces, never forcing his presence, never asking questions that might reveal impatience. Older figures observed him the way craftsmen examine raw material, quietly judging whether strength and discipline existed beneath the surface. Approval was never spoken directly, but opportunities slowly expanded. Someone who had once been asked only to watch a doorway might now be trusted to sit at a table, listening without interruption. Money entered the picture carefully. It was never described as salary, never predictable, and never discussed in detail. Cash appeared after successful errands or long nights of quiet work. The amounts were modest at first, yet they carried symbolic meaning. Payment signaled belonging. It confirmed that effort was being recognized, even if praise remained rare. Despite the growing connection to this underground world, ordinary life still continued around him. Families filled apartment buildings with familiar sounds, radios playing through open windows, children running across sidewalks, arguments that faded by morning. The contrast between normal routine and hidden activity created a strange balance. One existence remained visible and socially acceptable. The other operated in shadows, guided by rules outsiders would never fully understand. Law enforcement presence was also changing. Patrol cars passed more frequently. Investigators paid closer attention to patterns that once seemed invisible. Court cases in distant boroughs hinted that the government was beginning to understand structures long protected by secrecy. Some older men dismissed these developments as temporary pressure. Others grew quieter, sensing that the future might not resemble the past. Benjamin absorbed these tensions without outward reaction. Emotional restraint became one of his defining qualities. Anger and excitement, fear, none of it showed easily. In a world where careless emotion could expose weakness, calm behavior offered protection. People began to rely on that steadiness. He became someone trusted to remain composed when situations grew uncertain. Relationships deepened slowly. Bonds inside organized crime often resembled family connections, though they were built on obligation as much as affection. Loyalty demanded sacrifice. Personal comfort ranked far below group stability. Once commitment was proven, separation became nearly impossible. Walking away was not considered a real option. Even so, the life carried contradictions difficult to ignore. Moments of generosity appeared beside acts of intimidation. Camaraderie existed alongside constant suspicion. Celebrations could shift into mourning with little warning. Anyone paying close attention could sense that security inside this structure was never guaranteed, no matter how strong loyalty seemed. Benjamin's growing reputation rested not on dramatic action but on endurance. He stayed present through long hours and uncertain outcomes. He followed instructions without complaint. He protected conversations meant to remain private. These qualities made him valuable in ways louder personalities could never achieve. Quiet men often lasted longer, and longevity itself created influence. As months turned into years, the distance between observer and participant disappeared. Decisions made by others began to shape his own future directly. The lines separating personal identity from organizational role grew thinner. What had once felt like proximity to power now revealed itself as permanent attachment. Around him, the broader landscape of New York continued evolving. Economic pressures strained neighborhoods already living close to hardship. Political leaders promised reform while corruption scandals surfaced in newspapers. Federal prosecutors spoke publicly about dismantling criminal networks once considered untouchable. Change was approaching from multiple directions at once. Inside the social clubs, reactions remained mixed. Some believed tradition would protect them just as it had for decades. Others quietly prepared for conflict that might not look like violence, but like courtrooms, testimony, and long prison sentences. The future no longer felt predictable. Benjamin moved forward anyway, guided less by ambition than by momentum. Each decision connected to the next, forming a path that grew harder to leave behind. The loyalty he valued most was also the force tightening around his life. Commitment created belonging, but it also demanded permanence. Nothing about his journey appeared dramatic from the outside. There were no headlines, no sudden displays of wealth, no public recognition. Progress happened in silence, measured only by trust placed in his hands and expectations resting on his shoulders. Yet beneath that quiet surface, the stakes continued rising. The world he was entering did not forgive mistakes. It remembered weakness, and it required a level of devotion that few people could sustain without consequence. Still, he continued forward calm, disciplined, and certain that loyalty would guide him safely through whatever lay ahead. Time would eventually test that belief in ways no one standing in those dimly lit rooms could yet imagine. In a world where power rarely announced itself openly, the true measure of belonging could be found in the smallest shifts of responsibility. Nothing dramatic marked the moment when a man crossed from observer into trusted participant. Instead, change revealed itself through quiet decisions made by others, decisions about who could be present, who could listen, and who could be relied upon when circumstances grew uncertain. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, that transformation unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, shaped by patience rather than ambition. By this point in his life, routine had become structured around unspoken expectation. Days no longer followed ordinary patterns tied only to family or neighborhood rhythms. Time was organized by meetings that appeared casual, but carried deeper meaning, by errands that seemed simple yet required precision, and by conversations where what remained unsaid mattered more than the words themselves. The discipline required to move through this environment demanded constant awareness. One careless remark could travel farther than intended. One moment of hesitation could alter how others judged. Reliability. What distinguished Benjamin from many others was his consistency under pressure. He did not search for recognition or attempt to impress those with greater authority. Instead, he demonstrated value through steadiness. When tension filled a room, he remained composed. When instructions arrived without explanation, he carried them out without visible doubt. This emotional control created a sense of predictability that others found reassuring. In uncertain surroundings, predictability became a rare and powerful trait. The men who quietly guided operations paid attention to such qualities. Their leadership depended less on visible strength and more on accurate judgment of character. Choosing the wrong person for even a minor responsibility could expose vulnerabilities to rivals or investigators. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. Because of this, advancement happened cautiously. Every new task functioned as a test, even if the person being tested never heard the results spoken aloud. Financial activity formed another layer of complexity. Money moved through channels designed to appear ordinary, blending legitimate business with hidden arrangements. To outsiders, transactions looked routine. Inside the system, each exchange reflected relationships, obligations, and careful calculation. Benjamin learned quickly that understanding money meant understanding power. Those who controlled its movement shaped decisions far beyond what could be seen on the surface. Despite increasing involvement, visibility remained dangerous. Attention from law enforcement, rival groups, or even curious neighbors could create problems that discipline alone could not solve. Remaining unnoticed required careful balance. Present enough to fulfill responsibilities, invisible enough to avoid scrutiny. Benjamin's quiet personality suited this balance naturally. He neither sought the spotlight nor resisted necessary action. He simply occupied the space required of him. The broader atmosphere across New York continued shifting. Investigations into organized crime were becoming more coordinated, supported by new legal strategies designed to target entire networks rather than isolated individuals. Courtrooms replaced street confrontations as the primary battleground. Rumors circulated about long sentences handed down to men who once seemed protected by silence. These developments introduced a new kind of fear less immediate than violence, but far more permanent. Within private gatherings, conversations adapted. Voices lowered further. Meetings became smaller. Decisions were shared only with those who absolutely needed to know. The culture of secrecy, already strong, tightened even more. Benjamin observed these changes carefully. Survival depended on recognizing when the environment evolved and adjusting without hesitation. Personal life continued existing alongside hidden responsibilities, though the distance between the two kept widening. Family members sensed dedication to something they could not fully see. Questions remained unasked, partly out of respect, and partly out of instinctive caution. Maintaining this separation required emotional discipline equal to any demanded by the streets. Carrying secrets meant carrying weight that could never be shared openly. Even moments of success carried restraint. Celebrations stayed private, muted, and brief. Showing too much pride invited unwanted attention. Longevity, not excitement, defined real achievement. Benjamin embraced this mindset completely. His satisfaction came not from display, but from knowing he had fulfilled expectations placed before him. Yet beneath the surface calm, contradictions continued growing. Loyalty promised protection, but it also created vulnerability. The deeper trust extended, the greater the consequences if circumstances changed. Every relationship carried both strength and risk. Few people allowed themselves to think too deeply about this balance. Survival often depended on focusing only on the present task. Benjamin's reputation strengthened quietly. Older figures began treating him less like a helper and more like someone whose presence carried meaning. Invitations to more private discussions appeared. Responsibilities involved greater judgment, not just obedience. These subtle signals confirmed that he had crossed an invisible threshold. He now stood inside a circle that offered belonging few could ever reach. Still, uncertainty lingered beyond the edges of that acceptance. External pressure from law enforcement showed no sign of fading. Internal tensions, though rarely visible, existed within any organization built on hierarchy and ambition. Stability could never be assumed. The very qualities that created power also created fragility. Benjamin moved forward with the same calm determination that had guided him from the beginning. He trusted the code he had learned, believed in the value of loyalty, and accepted the sacrifices required to remain dependable. Doubt, if it appeared at all, stayed buried beneath discipline. The city around him continued its restless motion, traffic flowing through crowded streets. Neon lights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement. Lives intersecting without understanding how closely they brushed against hidden worlds. To most people, everything looked ordinary. Only those inside certain rooms understood how much depended on silence, patience, and unwavering trust. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain in direction, only an outcome. He had chosen his place, whether consciously or through gradual momentum. Turning back was no longer realistic. The structure surrounding him had become part of his identity, and within that structure the true test had not yet begun. Challenges were approaching that would measure loyalty in ways far beyond quiet errands or disciplined silence. Decisions would soon carry consequences impossible to ignore. Trust, once a source of strength, would face pressures capable of reshaping everything. For now, though, the night remained calm, and the streets still whispered rather than shouted. But silence, as he would eventually learn, never lasted forever. Respect inside hidden criminal circles was never granted through words alone. It formed slowly, built from observation, endurance, and the quiet approval of men who rarely explained their decisions. A name began to carry meaning only after years of steady presence, when others could rely on it without hesitation. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, that stage of life arrived without celebration, marked instead by a growing awareness that expectations around him had changed permanently. The streets of Brooklyn continued to move with familiar rhythm, storefront gates rising at dawn, traffic pressing through narrow avenues, voices drifting from apartment windows during warm evenings. To ordinary residents, life followed predictable patterns shaped by work, family, and routine struggle. Yet beneath that surface, another structure operated with its own rules and consequences. Inside that structure, identity depended less on who a man claimed to be and more on how consistently he fulfilled obligations no one outside the circle could see. Benjamin had reached a point where his presence was no longer questioned. He entered rooms without needing introduction. Conversations paused briefly when he arrived, not from suspicion but from recognition. These subtle signals revealed more than any spoken praise. They showed that trust had settled around him like an invisible shield, protective, yet heavy with responsibility. With deeper trust came greater exposure to the realities that sustained organized crime. Money flowed through networks designed to appear ordinary, touching businesses that looked legitimate from the sidewalk. Agreements formed through quiet negotiation rather than written contracts. Disputes were settled quickly, often before outsiders even realized conflict existed. Maintaining this balance required discipline from everyone involved. One careless decision could invite attention that endangered the entire structure. Benjamin learned that loyalty demanded more than obedience. It required emotional sacrifice, the willingness to place collective stability above personal comfort. Friendships blurred with duty. Kindness could exist alongside harsh judgment. Compassion, when shown, had to remain controlled. Living within these contradictions shaped a mindset built on endurance rather than hope. Law enforcement pressure continued tightening across New York. Investigators were no longer relying only on visible crimes. They were studying patterns, relationships, and financial movement. Courtrooms became arenas where silence faced new challenges. Long sentences handed down to once powerful figures sent quiet warnings through every social club and backroom meeting. The belief that tradition alone could guarantee safety was beginning to fade. Inside private gatherings, reactions varied. Some older men clung to confidence shaped by decades of survival. Others watched developments with careful concern, sensing that the system protecting them was changing in ways that could not be reversed. Benjamin absorbed these tensions silently. His role required steadiness, not speculation. Showing fear could weaken perception. Ignoring reality could prove even more dangerous. Balance became essential. Personal life grew more distant as responsibilities expanded. Moments of normalcy, shared meals, familiar laughter, brief calm felt increasingly fragile, as if belonging to a different existence entirely. Carrying secrets created separation that could never be fully explained. Even those closest to him could sense the weight he carried without understanding its source. Reputation, once earned, demanded constant protection. Inside organized crime, memory was long and forgiveness rare. A single mistake could erase years of loyalty. Because of this, Benjamin approached every task with careful precision. He avoided unnecessary risks, spoke only when needed, and maintained the calm demeanor others had come to expect. Discipline became both armor and prison, shielding him from danger while binding him to a life with few exits. The city itself seemed to mirror this tension. Bright lights reflected ambition and possibility, yet shadows gathered in doorways and alleyways where unseen negotiations shaped outcomes far beyond public view. Economic struggle touched many neighborhoods, creating desperation that fed the underground world. Opportunity and danger existed side by side, often indistinguishable until it was too late. Benjamin's name now carried quiet recognition among those who mattered inside that hidden system. It represented reliability, patience, and unwavering loyalty. Such recognition might appear powerful, yet it also deepened obligation. The more trusted a man became, the less freedom he possessed. Expectations followed him everywhere, even into moments meant for rest. Conversations around him hinted at change approaching from multiple directions. Federal strategies were evolving. Internal tensions within organized crime families were becoming harder to ignore. Alliances that once seemed permanent showed signs of strain. Stability, always fragile, felt increasingly uncertain. Still, daily routines continued, because stopping was never an option. Benjamin remained committed to the code that had guided his entire journey. Loyalty was not something he measured against comfort or safety. It was an identity, one he carried without question. Whether that devotion would ultimately protect or destroy him remained impossible to know. In this world, outcomes often revealed themselves only when choices could no longer be undone. Time moved forward with quiet inevitability. Each passing year tightened the connection between his fate and the fate of the organizations surrounding him. Individual dream faded, replaced by collective survival. The life he lived offered respect and belonging, yet demanded silence and sacrifice in equal measure. Those who watched from outside might have seen only an ordinary man walking familiar streets. They could not see the invisible weight attached to his name, or the constant vigilance required to carry it. Inside the hidden structure of organized crime, identity was never simple. It was built from loyalty, tested by pressure, and remembered long after a man himself was gone. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the path ahead was narrowing. Forces beyond his control were beginning to gather, legal, personal, and internal. None had yet collided, but their direction was clear. The calm that surrounded his life felt less like peace and more like the stillness that arrives before something irreversible begins. And once that moment arrived, loyalty alone might not be enough to hold everything together. In certain corners of New York, the most important decisions were never spoken loudly. They were carried in low voices across small tables, exchanged between men who understood that power often depended on how little attention it attracted. Promises formed in those quiet moments could shape entire lives, binding people together through loyalty that felt stronger than law, stronger than fear, and sometimes stronger than reason itself. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had long since learned that survival inside organized crime required more than courage. It demanded patience measured in years, emotional control that never slipped in public, and a willingness to accept outcomes that could not be negotiated. Every favor carried weight. Every agreement created obligation. Nothing truly disappeared once it was spoken. By this stage of his life, the rhythm of his days had settled into a pattern defined by responsibility rather than choice. Movement through the city followed invisible routes shaped by trust and necessity. Conversations unfolded carefully, often surrounded by coded language or meaningful silence. Even ordinary settings, a cafe, a parked car, a quiet sidewalk, could become places where decisions were made that would never be recorded anywhere official. What distinguished Benjamin was not ambition but steadiness. Others sometimes chased recognition or quick advancement, believing visibility meant importance. He understood the opposite was often true. The men who lasted longest were those who blended into the background while remaining completely dependable. Reliability, once proven, became a form of quiet power. Financial activities surrounding him continued to grow more complex. Money flowed through businesses that appeared legitimate, through partnerships designed to hide their real purpose, and through exchanges that relied entirely on trust. Handling such movement required discipline and precision. A single careless mistake could expose far more than lost cash. It could reveal the structure behind it. Because of this, responsibility was granted only to those considered unbreakably loyal. Benjamin accepted these duties without display. He neither celebrated success nor complained about pressure. To outsiders, his life might have seemed uneventful, even ordinary. Inside the hidden world he occupied, calm consistency signaled strength. People began to depend on that strength in ways that were never openly acknowledged. Yet beneath the routine, tension continued to build across the broader landscape of organized crime. Federal investigations were expanding, supported by new legal strategies that allowed prosecutors to connect individuals into larger conspiracies. Court cases no longer focused only on isolated acts, but on entire systems of operation. Long sentences handed down to powerful figures sent a quiet but unmistakable message. The old sense of invulnerability was fading. These developments changed conversations inside private rooms. Some men responded with denial, insisting that tradition and silence would continue to protect them. Others grew more cautious, reducing risks and limiting exposure wherever possible. The atmosphere shifted from confidence to careful calculation. Benjamin watched these changes without speaking much about them. Observation remained one of his greatest strengths. Personal relationships also carried increasing complexity. Loyalty to the organization demanded time, secrecy, and emotional distance that ordinary friendships could not easily survive. Family members sensed commitment to something beyond their understanding. Concern appeared in small gestures and unasked questions. Explaining the truth was impossible, yet silence created its own quiet pain. Moments of reflection came rarely, but when they did, they revealed the cost of the life he had chosen. Respect existed, but it came with constant pressure. Belonging felt real, yet it depended on conditions that could change without warning. The deeper he moved into this world, the fewer paths remained open behind him. Turning away was no longer a simple decision, it was nearly unimaginable. Still, he remained devoted to the code that had shaped him. Loyalty was not something he evaluated against comfort or safety. It was an identity he carried without hesitation. In his mind, standing firm through uncertainty defined a man's worth more than any reward ever could. Whether that belief would ultimately protect or destroy him was a question the future alone could answer. Around him, New York continued its restless motion. Sirens echoed through crowded streets. Neon lights reflected across rain-slick pavement. Lives intersected every day without recognizing how closely they brushed against hidden struggles unfolding just beyond sight. The city felt alive with possibility and danger at the same time, never fully revealing which would arrive first. Inside the quiet rooms where promises were made, conversations grew more serious. Discussions about loyalty carried sharper edges. The possibility of betrayal, once considered distant, began appearing in cautious whispers. Trust, the foundation of everything, felt slightly less certain than before. Even the strongest bonds showed faint signs of strain. Benjamin responded the only way he knew how, by remaining steady. He fulfilled every expectation placed before him, spoke carefully, and avoided actions that might create doubt. His reputation for unwavering reliability continued to strengthen, making him both valuable and deeply bound to the system surrounding him. The very loyalty that earned respect also tightened the grip of obligation. Time moved forward without pause. Each passing day carried the sense that something larger was approaching, though no one could clearly define its shape. Change rarely announced itself until it was already impossible to stop. Those who sensed it earliest often had the least power to avoid it. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the promises spoken in low voices had become the structure of his entire life. They guided his choices, defined his relationships, and shaped a future growing more uncertain with every passing year. Loyalty remained his compass even as the world around him began to shift in ways loyalty alone might not control. The silence that once felt protective was beginning to feel fragile. And fragile silence, in a world without mercy, never lasted long. Time has a quiet way of revealing truths that once stayed hidden beneath routine. In the streets and social clubs where loyalty defined identity, the passing years did not simply move forward, they deepened everything. Trust became heavier, promises became harder to keep, and the shadows surrounding organized crime stretched longer than anyone wanted to admit. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, life continued along a path shaped by discipline and devotion. His reputation for steadiness had become firmly established, and with that reputation came expectations that never faded. Every decision, no matter how small, carried consequences that could ripple far beyond a single moment. Remaining reliable was no longer just important, it was essential to survival. The environment around him, however, was changing in ways that could not be controlled through loyalty alone. Federal investigators were becoming more strategic, building cases patiently rather than rushing toward arrests. Surveillance techniques improved. Informants, once considered rare and dishonorable, appeared with unsettling frequency. Courtrooms began replacing street corners as the true battleground for power. These developments introduced a different kind of tension, one that could not be confronted with strength or silence alone. Violence, the traditional language of control and organized crime, offered little protection against legal systems designed to dismantle entire networks piece by piece. Men who once seemed untouchable now faced years behind prison walls, their authority fading under fluorescent courtroom lights. Inside private gatherings, conversations carried a new weight. Words were chosen more carefully. Meetings became shorter and more selective. Even long-standing friendships felt slightly uncertain, as if invisible cracks had begun forming beneath familiar surfaces. Suspicion did not need proof to exist. The mere possibility of betrayal could change how people looked at one another. Benjamin responded to this shifting atmosphere the same way he had faced every challenge, through calm endurance. He avoided unnecessary attention, followed instructions precisely, and maintained the quiet discipline that defined his character. Others continued to rely on him because he did not panic when circumstances grew complicated. In uncertain times, emotional control became more valuable than ever. Yet beneath his steady exterior, the emotional cost of this life continued to grow. Carrying constant vigilance required energy that never fully returned. Moments of peace felt temporary, as though interruption could arrive at any second. The distance between personal identity and organizational duty widened until the two were nearly impossible to separate. Family life reflected this strain in subtle ways. Conversations remained warm but cautious, filled with subjects safe enough to discuss aloud. Concern showed itself through silence more than questions. Those closest to him sensed the pressure surrounding his world without needing details. Love existed, but it could not remove the risks tied to loyalty. The city itself seemed to mirror this quiet unease. Buildings aged, neighborhoods shifted, and economic struggles touched families across every borough. Beneath the noise of traffic and daily routine, a deeper uncertainty settled over New York. Change was happening everywhere at once, legal, social, and personal, reshaping futures that once felt predictable. Within organized crime, leadership faced difficult choices. Maintaining tradition meant resisting forces growing stronger each year. Adapting required decisions that challenged long-held beliefs about honor and silence. Some clung to the past with stubborn confidence. Others recognized that survival might demand uncomfortable transformation. No single path guaranteed safety. Benjamin remained committed to the values he had carried since youth. Loyalty, in his mind, was not conditional. It was the foundation of identity, the measure of a man's worth when everything else disappeared. Even as circumstances grew more dangerous, he held tightly to that belief. Letting go would have meant losing the only certainty he had ever known. But loyalty alone could not stop time. Investigations continued advancing. Court cases multiplied. Sentences grew longer. Each headline involving organized crime sent quiet shockwaves through the hidden world he inhabited. The sense of permanence that once defined that world was slowly eroding, replaced by uncertainty no one could fully escape. Opportunities for reflection appeared in rare, quiet moments late at night, in empty rooms, or during long drives through sleeping streets. In those moments, the cost of every decision felt clearer. Respect had been earned, but at the price of freedom. Belonging had been achieved, but without security. The life built on loyalty offered meaning, yet demanded sacrifice without limit. Still, turning away remained impossible. Too much time had passed. Too many promises had been made. The structure surrounding him was no longer separate from who he was. Whatever future awaited would have to be faced from within, not outside. Around him, whispers of coming change grew louder. Not dramatic enough to cause panic, but steady enough to create unease. Something was approaching, something that would test every belief holding this hidden world together. No one knew exactly when it would arrive, only that it would. Benjamin continued forward with quiet determination, carrying loyalty like armor against an uncertain future. His calm presence reassured others even as unseen forces gathered strength beyond anyone's control. Discipline remained his shield, silence his protection, endurance his only strategy. But shadows, once small and distant, were now stretching across everything. And when shadows grow longer than loyalty, even the strongest devotion can begin to feel fragile. Silence had always been a form of protection in the hidden world Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero inhabited. Words spoken too freely could travel farther than intended, and curiosity often created dangers that patience could avoid. For years, quiet discipline had served as both shield and compass, guiding decisions through an environment where survival depended on restraint. Yet silence, like every other safeguard in that world, carried limits that revealed themselves only when pressure became impossible to ignore. The streets of New York still moved with their familiar rhythm, taxis rushing beneath glowing streetlights, storefronts closing behind metal gates, distant sirens echoing through crowded neighborhoods. To most people, life unfolded in ordinary patterns shaped by work, family, and routine ambition. Beneath that ordinary surface, however, a quieter tension continued to build. Forces larger than any single crew or neighborhood were beginning to reshape the structure of organized crime across the city. Federal investigations had grown patient and methodical, replacing sudden action with long observation. Instead of targeting isolated incidents, authorities focused on entire networks, mapping relationships and financial pathways with careful precision. Courtrooms, once distant concerns, now represented the most serious threat to long-standing power. Lengthy prison sentences were no longer rare possibilities, but increasingly common outcomes. Each conviction sent an unspoken warning through the hidden rooms where decisions were made. Inside those rooms, conversations had changed. Laughter appeared less often. Meetings became shorter, quieter, and more selective. Trust once assumed between men bound by loyalty required constant reassurance. Even the smallest uncertainty could create doubt. Suspicion did not need evidence, it thrived on fear alone. The code of silence remained sacred, yet the pressure surrounding it felt heavier than ever before. Benjamin responded to this atmosphere the only way he knew, by remaining steady. His reputation for calm endurance had carried him through years of uncertainty, and others continued to rely on that steadiness now. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he reacted, and fulfilled every responsibility without hesitation. In a world growing increasingly unstable, predictability became a rare comfort. Still, emotional strain accumulated quietly beneath the surface. Constant vigilance required energy that never fully returned. Sleep felt lighter, easily broken by distant noise or restless thought. Moments of peace arrived briefly, then disappeared beneath awareness that circumstances could change without warning. Carrying such tension without visible reaction demanded strength few people truly understood. Family life reflected this quiet burden. Conversations remained warm but cautious, filled with ordinary subjects that avoided deeper truths. Concern appeared in subtle gestures, a longer glance, a softer tone, silence where questions might have been asked. Love existed, yet it could not shield anyone from consequences tied to loyalty. The separation between personal life and hidden obligation widened until it felt almost permanent. Across the broader landscape of organized crime, internal pressures were also increasing. Competition for influence created friction beneath outward unity. Decisions affecting multiple crews required delicate negotiation, where pride and survival often collided. Maintaining balance demanded careful judgment from leaders who understood that one mistake could ignite conflict impossible to control. Benjamin witnessed these tensions without seeking involvement beyond what duty required. His strength remained reliability, not ambition. He believed deeply in loyalty as the foundation of identity, a principle that had guided every step of his life. Letting go of that belief would have meant losing the meaning behind years of sacrifice. Even as uncertainty grew, he held firmly to the code that defined him. Yet time continued moving forward, indifferent to loyalty or tradition. Legal strategies evolved. Informants appeared in places once considered secure. Surveillance reached deeper into private spaces. The invisible wall protecting organized crime for generations was beginning to crack, though many refused to see it clearly. Denial offered temporary comfort, but reality waited patiently. New York itself seemed caught between eras. Old neighborhoods changed as new opportunities emerged. Economic struggles reshaped communities. Cultural shifts altered how power and authority were understood. The city never stopped moving, yet something about its motion felt different, less predictable, more fragile. Those paying close attention sensed transformation unfolding beneath everyday routine. Within this shifting world, Benjamin's calm presence remained constant. Others trusted him because he did not waver even when circumstances grew uncertain. He carried responsibility without complaint, protected conversations meant to remain private, and stood firm in moments when fear tempted others to retreat. Such loyalty inspired respect, but it also deepened the weight resting on his shoulders. Whispers of coming disruption grew more frequent, not loud enough to cause panic, yet impossible to ignore. Investigations were tightening. Court cases were expanding. The future no longer resembled the past that had shaped so many lives. Something irreversible was approaching, moving slowly but with undeniable certainty. Benjamin could feel that change without fully understanding its form. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, teaching him to recognize danger before it appeared openly. The silence surrounding him no longer felt protective. Instead, it carried the uneasy stillness that comes just before a storm breaks. Even so, he continued forward with disciplined calm. Loyalty remained his guide, endurance his strategy, silence his shield. Whatever future awaited would have to be faced the same way he had faced everything else, without hesitation, without retreat, and without betraying the code he believed defined a man's true worth. But silence, once broken, can never be restored to what it was before. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets and dimly lit rooms, The first cracks in that silence were already beginning to spread. There are moments in every hidden life when certainty begins to slip, not all at once, but slowly, like light fading at the end of a long day. Nothing dramatic announces the change. The streets still look the same. Conversations still happen in low voices. Familiar faces still gather in the same quiet rooms. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental begins to shift. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, that shift arrived as a feeling more than an event, an awareness that loyalty, the principle he trusted above everything else, was approaching a test unlike any he had faced before. New York continued moving with restless energy, its nights alive with motion and noise that masked deeper tension. Beneath glowing signs and passing traffic, invisible struggles unfolded between power and law, secrecy and exposure, tradition and change. Federal investigations had grown more precise, guided by patience rather than urgency. Instead of sudden confrontations, authorities relied on time, observation, and carefully built cases designed to reach far beyond individual crimes. The pressure created by this strategy did not explode. It tightened gradually, leaving little room to breathe. Inside the quiet circles where Benjamin spent much of his life, the emotional atmosphere had changed. Trust still existed, but it carried hesitation. Conversations paused more often, as if each person weighed every word before allowing it to be heard. Familiar laughter sounded thinner, less certain. Even long-standing bonds felt touched by invisible strain. Loyalty remained sacred, yet doubt had begun to move silently through the spaces between people. Benjamin responded with the same calm discipline that had always defined him. He listened carefully, spoke only when necessary, and carried out every responsibility with steady precision. Others continued to rely on him because he did not show panic or confusion. His strength lay in endurance, the ability to remain grounded while uncertainty grew around him. Yet even the strongest endurance cannot prevent awareness from forming in quiet moments of reflection. Late at night, when the city softened and noise faded into distant echoes, thought became unavoidable. Questions that could not be spoken aloud appeared in silence. How long could the old ways survive in a world that was changing so quickly? Could loyalty alone protect anyone from forces growing stronger each year? These thoughts did not weaken his devotion, but they introduced a new emotional weight, one shaped by uncertainty rather than fear. Family life offered brief refuge from that tension, though even refuge carried limits. Warm conversations and shared routines created moments that felt untouched by danger. Yet the separation between those peaceful spaces and the hidden realities of his obligations continued widening. Love remained present, but it existed beside knowledge that some consequences could never be prevented. Protecting others sometimes meant allowing distance to grow, even when closeness was what the heart desired most. Across the broader world of organized crime, transformation was unfolding quietly. Leadership faced decisions that balanced survival against tradition. Some believed stricter discipline could preserve stability. Others sensed that adaptation might be the only path forward. These disagreements rarely surfaced openly, yet their presence could be felt in subtle changes, altered routines, cautious conversations, and the careful reconsideration of trust. Benjamin watched these developments without seeking control over them. His identity had never depended on authority or ambition. It rested on loyalty, patience, and the belief that standing firm through hardship defined true strength. Even as uncertainty deepened, he remained committed to that belief. Changing course felt impossible, not only because of external consequences, but because doing so would have meant abandoning the values that shaped his entire life. Still, the outside world continued pressing inward. Court cases grew more complex, sentences became longer. Informants appeared where silence had once seemed unbreakable. Each new development weakened the illusion that tradition alone could guarantee safety. The structure surrounding organized crime was not collapsing suddenly. It was eroding slowly, piece by piece, like stone worn down by years of unseen pressure. New York itself reflected this slow transformation. Neighborhoods shifted, economies changed, and new generations viewed power differently than those before them. The city's constant motion made change feel ordinary, yet for those whose lives depended on stability, that motion carried quiet danger. Nothing remained permanent, not influence, not protection, not even the sense of belonging that once felt certain. Benjamin's calm presence continued to reassure those around him, but internally, Awareness had deepened. Loyalty was still his guiding force, yet he could sense that loyalty might soon demand a price greater than endurance alone could pay. The future no longer appeared as a distant horizon. It felt close enough to touch, though its shape remained unclear. Whispers of coming disruption moved through conversations like faint echoes. No one spoke directly about what might happen, yet everyone seemed to feel it approaching. The silence that once protected now carried tension, as if holding back something inevitable. Waiting became its own form of strain, stretching time into something heavy and uncertain. Even so, Benjamin did not retreat. Retreat was never part of the code he followed. He continued forward with quiet determination, fulfilling every duty, honoring every promise, and trusting that loyalty, no matter how difficult, remained the only path he could walk with dignity. Strength, to him, meant standing firm even when the ground beneath felt unsteady. But truth has a way of revealing itself when silence grows too heavy to hold it back. And somewhere within the shifting balance between trust and doubt, that truth was already beginning to surface slowly, quietly, and without mercy. In hidden worlds built on secrecy, the most dangerous moments rarely arrive with noise. They come quietly, almost gently, disguised as ordinary days. A familiar street looks unchanged. A routine meeting unfolds as expected. Voices remain calm, faces controlled. Yet beneath that calm surface, something irreversible begins to move. For men whose lives depend on loyalty, the difference between safety and collapse can exist in a single unseen decision. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had spent years believing that trust, once proven through endurance and sacrifice, formed a kind of protection stronger than circumstance. Loyalty was not simply a rule in his life, it was the foundation beneath every choice he made. Standing firm, remaining silent, honoring promises, no matter the cost, these principles shaped his identity so completely that imagining life without them felt impossible. But time has a way of testing even the strongest beliefs, especially in a world where survival and betrayal often stand closer together than anyone wants to admit. New York continued to pulse with restless motion, its crowded streets hiding countless private struggles behind ordinary routine. To the public eye, life moved forward with familiar energy, businesses opening at dawn, traffic pressing through intersections, neon reflections stretching across wet pavement at night. Beneath that visible rhythm, however, another tension had begun tightening. Investigations were no longer distant threats whispered about in quiet rooms. They had become an undeniable force, moving steadily closer to the inner circles where secrecy once felt secure. Federal authorities had grown patient, methodical, and determined. Instead of chasing isolated crimes, they focused on relationships, communication, and patterns invisible to casual observers. The strategy was simple but powerful: dismantle entire structures rather than individual actions. Courtrooms replaced street corners as the true stage where power would be challenged. Long prison sentences now stood where confidence once lived. Inside private gatherings, emotional currents had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. The conversations paused more often. Words were weighed carefully before being spoken. Familiar faces carried expressions shaped by quiet concern rather than certainty. No one openly admitted fear, yet everyone could feel the pressure surrounding them. Trust still existed, but it no longer felt unquestionable. Even the strongest bonds showed faint shadows of doubt. Benjamin responded as he always had, with calm endurance. He fulfilled responsibilities without hesitation, spoke little, and listened closely. Others continued to rely on his steadiness because he did not allow emotion to guide his actions. In uncertain times, discipline offered the only sense of control available. Yet beneath that composed exterior, awareness had begun to deepen. Silence no longer felt entirely protective. It felt fragile, as though one unexpected revelation could break everything apart. Late-night reflection brought thoughts he could never share aloud. Loyalty had guided every step of his life, but loyalty required trust in return. What happened when trust itself became uncertain? The question lingered without answer, heavy and persistent. Doubt did not replace his devotion, but it changed the emotional landscape inside him. Strength now required not only endurance, but acceptance that some outcomes could not be prevented. Family moments carried a different emotional tone warmth and familiarity remained, yet time together felt more precious, touched by an unspoken understanding that life could change suddenly. Protecting loved ones sometimes meant silence, distance, and sacrifice invisible to anyone outside of the hidden world he inhabited. Love existed alongside inevitability, each unable to fully overcome the other. Across organized crime, unseen fractures were forming. Pressure from law enforcement exposed weaknesses long hidden by tradition and fear. Internal tensions surfaced quietly, shaped by suspicion and survival instinct. Decisions grew more complicated as risks increased. Unity, once assumed, now required constant effort to maintain. No one could predict where the next threat might emerge from outside forces or within trusted circles. Benjamin remained committed to the code that defined him. Turning away from loyalty was unthinkable, not only because of consequences, but because it would erase the meaning behind his entire life. Standing firm, even in uncertainty, felt like the only honorable path. Yet honor in such a world often carried a cost far greater than anyone expected at the beginning. The city itself seemed to sense approaching change. Its endless motion continued, but beneath the noise lived a quiet tension, as though something inevitable was drawing closer with each passing day. Nothing visible announced the shift, yet instinct recognized it. Moments before storms break often feel strangely calm, suspended between past and future. Whispers moved through conversations like distant echoes. Someone questioned. Someone hesitated. Someone watched more carefully than before. These were small changes, barely noticeable alone, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The invisible line between trust and betrayal was no longer distant. It was near closer than anyone wished to believe. Benjamin carried this awareness silently, just as he carried every burden in his life. His strength remained endurance, his shield remained loyalty, and his path remained unchanged. Whatever waited ahead would have to be faced without hesitation. Retreat was never an option for someone who had built identity on devotion alone, but in worlds shaped by secrecy, betrayal rarely announces itself until the moment it is already complete. And somewhere within the tightening circle of trust, that moment was drawing closer, quiet, unseen, and impossible to stop. There are moments in hidden lives when reality stops moving quietly and begins pressing forward with undeniable force. For years, the world surrounding Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had been shaped by silence, discipline, and the belief that loyalty could withstand anything. That belief had carried him through uncertainty, strengthened his reputation, and defined the meaning of his existence. Yet time does not pause for belief, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. New York continued to glow with restless energy, its streets alive with motion that disguised deeper tension. To ordinary people, the city remained a place of opportunity and struggle, ambition and routine. Beneath that visible life, however, another reality had begun to close in. Investigations that once felt distant were now uncomfortably close. Legal strategies had evolved beyond anything earlier generations had faced. The invisible shield that secrecy once provided was weakening, and everyone inside that hidden world could feel it. Federal authorities were no longer reacting, they were anticipating. Surveillance had grown more sophisticated. Evidence was gathered patiently, carefully, and over long stretches of time. The goal was no longer a single arrest or isolated conviction. The goal was dismantling entire structures, removing the foundation rather than striking the surface. Courtrooms had become the true battleground, where silence offered little protection, and loyalty could not rewrite facts presented under oath. Inside private rooms where decisions were made in low voices, the atmosphere had changed in ways impossible to ignore. Conversations carried tension, even when words remained calm. Familiar expressions now held caution. Trust still existed, but it felt strained, as if stretched too tightly. No one spoke openly about fear, yet the absence of certainty could be felt in every pause between sentences. Benjamin faced this changing world with the same calm endurance that had defined him for years. He continued fulfilling responsibilities without hesitation, maintaining discipline even as uncertainty grew heavier. Others still relied on his steadiness, because predictability had become rare. In an environment where everything felt unstable, his quiet consistency offered reassurance. Yet beneath that steady exterior, awareness had sharpened. Loyalty had always been his compass, guiding him through danger and doubt alike. Now, for the first time, loyalty felt less like protection and more like weight. Not because he questioned it, but because circumstances were changing in ways loyalty alone could not control. Devotion remained unbroken, yet the world around it was shifting beyond recognition. Moments of reflection arrived more often, usually in silence. Late nights stretched longer, filled with thoughts that could not be spoken aloud. Questions formed without clear answers. How much could one person endure in the name of loyalty? What happened when truth and devotion moved in different directions? These were not questions he welcomed, yet they refused to disappear. Family life provided warmth, but even warmth carried a fragile edge. Time together felt increasingly precious, as though measured against something unseen. Conversations remained gentle and familiar, yet beneath them lived an awareness that life could change suddenly. Protecting loved ones meant continuing forward without revealing the full danger surrounding him. Love demanded silence just as loyalty did. Across the broader landscape of organized crime, pressure was no longer abstract. Arrests, indictments, and long sentences had become visible reality. Leaders who once appeared untouchable now faced futures defined by prison walls rather than influence. Each legal victory against the organization weakened the illusion of permanence that had sustained it for generations. The past could no longer guarantee the future. Internal tension grew alongside external threat. Suspicion, once rare among trusted allies, now appeared in subtle glances and cautious conversations. Unity required effort instead of assumption. Decisions carried consequences that reached farther than before. Every choice felt heavier, shaped by knowledge that mistakes could not be undone. Benjamin remained loyal without hesitation. Turning away from the code that defined his life was unimaginable. Even as truth pressed closer, he chose endurance. Strength, in his understanding, meant standing firm when circumstances became unbearable. Whether that strength would protect him or lead him toward sacrifice remained uncertain, but uncertainty had never changed his path before. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Traffic still moved, lights still shone, and voices still filled the night. Yet beneath the familiar motion lived a quiet sense of approaching change. Moments before storms break often feel strangely calm, suspended between what has been and what is coming. That calm now surrounded everything. Whispers of revelation moved through hidden conversations. Something long protected by silence was nearing exposure. No one could fully predict how events would unfold, only that the direction was unavoidable. Time, once an ally, had become something else entirely, an unstoppable force carrying truth toward daylight. Benjamin felt that movement even without seeing its full shape. Years of instinct had taught him to recognize danger before it appeared openly. The weight pressing against his world was no longer distant. It was here, immediate and undeniable. Still, he did not retreat. Loyalty allowed no retreat, only endurance. He continued forward with quiet resolve, carrying devotion like armor against a future growing clearer with every passing day. Whatever truth waited ahead would be faced without betrayal, without surrender, and without abandoning the principles that had defined his life from the beginning. But truth, once revealed, changes everything it touches, and the moment of revelation was now closer than silence could hide. Time has a way of gathering momentum, of bringing the consequences of countless small choices into focus at once. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the life he had built on loyalty, patience, and discretion suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a fragile structure teetering on a narrow edge. The past, once a distant landscape of learned lessons and quiet victories, was beginning to collide with the present in ways that could not be avoided or ignored. New York continued to pulse with energy, its streets alive with the familiar hum of movement and commerce. Yet beneath the apparent normalcy, invisible currents carried tension that could snap at any moment. Investigations into organized crime had grown methodical and precise. Evidence was no longer pursued as individual acts, but mapped across networks, tracing relationships and financial exchanges with painstaking detail. Each piece of paper, each recorded conversation, each minor error in routine had the potential to shift the balance from security to exposure. In this world, silence alone was no longer enough. Benjamin understood that even the most disciplined vigilance could not shield him from forces gathering beyond his control. Decisions made years ago, seemingly small and unremarkable at the time, were now rippling forward with consequences he could neither prevent nor fully anticipate. Loyalty remained his compass, yet its effectiveness depended on the structure of trust that now felt thinner, more fragile, under the combined weight of law enforcement pressure and internal instability. Inside private gatherings, tension had become almost tangible. Words were measured carefully, gestures calculated, and meanings kept deliberately short. The air seemed heavier, filled with unspoken awareness that nothing could be taken for granted. Even long-standing allies approached one another cautiously, weighing motives and testing subtle reactions. Suspicion, once rare, had begun to infiltrate spaces previously defined by unwavering trust. Every conversation contained layers of meaning that could conceal loyalty or hint at betrayal. Benjamin navigated this environment with the same calm he had relied on for years. He maintained consistency in action, patience in observation, and steadiness in judgment. Others relied on his presence not because he sought influence, but because his reliability provided a quiet anchor amid growing uncertainty. Yet he could not ignore the subtle shifts around him, the faint unease in a glance, the hesitation in a voice, the invisible pressure building towards something inevitable. Family life continued as a fragile refuge. Moments of warmth and familiarity offered fleeting comfort. Yet even there, the demands of his hidden responsibilities left traces of distance. Protecting loved ones meant keeping them at arm's length from a world they could never fully understand. Love existed alongside sacrifice, but its presence could not diminish the risks that shadowed every step he took. The tension between personal loyalty and professional obligation weighed heavily, shaping decisions that could not be reversed. The landscape of organized crime itself was evolving. Leadership faced unprecedented challenges, balancing survival against tradition. Competition for influence created subtle but persistent friction. Decisions regarding alliances, territory, and financial operations were no longer guided solely by hierarchy or history. They required constant recalibration in response to legal scrutiny and internal dynamics. Maintaining stability demanded skill, patience, and an ability to anticipate both visible and invisible threats. Benjamin's own awareness of these changes had sharpened. He recognized patterns others might overlook, sensed subtle shifts in mood and behavior, and anticipated moves before they were openly declared. Yet even his experience could not provide certainty. The past had created this moment, and no amount of preparation could fully insulate him from its consequences. The careful balance he'd maintained for so long was now subject to forces moving independently of loyalty or skill, even as external pressures mounted. His internal code remained unbroken. Loyalty, discipline, and restraint continued to define his actions. He did not seek recognition or power beyond the responsibilities assigned to him. His identity remained rooted in endurance, remaining steadfast when fear, uncertainty, and temptation sought to intrude. This commitment earned respect, but it also deepened the weight he carried, as every small misstep could now have ramifications far beyond the immediate circle of influence. The city itself mirrored these tensions. Streets remained busy, neon lights flickered across wet pavements, and life appeared to continue normally. Yet beneath that motion, currents of uncertainty shifted constantly. Economic change, generational differences, and evolving social structures combined to create a backdrop where stability felt increasingly fragile. Nothing was permanent, not influence, not loyalty, not even the sense of belonging that had once seemed unshakable. Within this environment, Benjamin's focus remained on discipline and observation. He understood that patience had always been his greatest ally, yet the challenges he now faced required more than patience alone. Adaptation without compromise became a necessity. He moved carefully, fulfilling duties with precision, maintaining discretion, and ensuring that every action reinforced trust while minimizing exposure to danger. Whispers of change continued to ripple through hidden conversations. Decisions made quietly years ago were resurfacing, reshaping the present in subtle yet profound ways. Even allies began questioning assumptions once considered unshakable. The line between past and present had blurred, and Benjamin felt acutely that the past was no longer simply history. It was a force actively shaping his future. Despite the mounting pressure, he remained resolute. Retreat was impossible, and surrender was not in his nature. Loyalty and discipline were not just principles, they were survival tools, deeply ingrained and unyielding. Facing the collision of past and present required calm clarity, careful judgment, and a willingness to bear consequences without complaint. Yet even the most disciplined men eventually confront moments they cannot fully control. The structures of trust and secrecy, once protective, now carried fragility. Actions taken decades earlier, meant to preserve safety and honor, could produce unintended consequences that threatened everything carefully built. Awareness alone was insufficient. Endurance, foresight, and courage had to combine to navigate the approaching reality. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the collision of past and present was not sudden, dramatic, or public. It arrived quietly, in measured steps, in glances and conversations that carried more meaning than words. The weight of choices made years ago pressed forward, demanding attention and resolution. He moved forward, as always, with discipline, patience, and loyalty guiding him, but with the awareness that some truths, no matter how carefully managed, could never be contained indefinitely. And as the shadows of the past met the realities of the present, he understood clearly that the only path through was to remain steady, endure the pressure, and meet whatever consequence arrived with the same unwavering resolve that had defined his entire life. In the quiet corners of life hidden from public view, obligations weigh differently than they do elsewhere. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, each promise, each act of loyalty, carried invisible chains that shaped every choice he made. These were obligations that could not be measured by money, influence, or even recognition. They existed in a world where a single misstep could unravel years of careful strategy, and where trust, once broken, could never fully be restored. New York moved relentlessly outside, indifferent to the struggles taking place behind closed doors. Streets bustled with activity, taxis honked, neon signs flickered. Vendors called to passing pedestrians, but within the rooms and private spaces where decisions truly mattered, silence and subtle gestures governed the day. Conversations were economical, measured, and purposeful, with each word chosen for its impact and precision. The stakes had grown steadily higher, and even the smallest miscommunication could ripple outward with devastating effect. Benjamin had spent years cultivating a reputation for steadiness and reliability, and that reputation had earned him a level of trust few others could claim. Men around him knew he would fulfill any responsibility without hesitation, even when the cost was personal or dangerous. Yet the higher the trust, the heavier the obligation became. Every favor, every decision, every act of loyalty created links that could neither be undone nor ignored. The weight of these invisible chains pressed on him daily, shaping his movements, his speech, and his very sense of self. The pressures from law enforcement had not eased. Surveillance, indictments, and ongoing investigations continued to tighten the noose around the larger structure. Whereas earlier generations relied heavily on fear and secrecy to maintain control, the modern approach of patient, evidence-based scrutiny challenged those foundations. Courtrooms had replaced backrooms as the decisive arena, and even a man as disciplined as Benjamin could feel the tension pressing inward. Every movement, every decision, now carried consequences that reached far beyond the immediate circle of associates. Within the private gatherings of his world, subtle changes had begun to accumulate. Caution had replaced casual trust. Observations became scrutiny. Even long-standing alliances required reaffirmation through action rather than assumption. Benjamin noticed the smallest shifts in behavior, the pause before a reply, the slight change in tone, the careful avoidance of certain topics. These details mattered because in a world governed by loyalty and secrecy, a perception often equaled reality. Benjamin navigated these dynamics with precision. He spoke little, acted deliberately, and observed constantly. Others relied on him not because he sought authority, but because consistency itself had become a rare commodity. In times of uncertainty, those who could maintain composure were relied upon as stabilizing forces. His reputation for steadfastness provided both protection and responsibility, a duality he had long accepted as part of his life. Yet personal costs continued to mount. Emotional fatigue was nearly constant, a quiet burden that could not be expressed aloud. Moments of peace were fleeting, always shadowed by awareness that circumstances could change in an instant. Family interactions, though warm, carried undertones of concern and distance. Benjamin knew he could protect loved ones only by maintaining a boundary between them and the complexities of his obligations. Love and loyalty intertwined, yet never without tension, and he had learned to navigate that delicate balance with care. Beyond the walls of private meetings, the broader environment of organized crime was shifting. Competition for influence, increasing scrutiny from authorities, and the erosion of traditional safeguards created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Decisions that once seemed straightforward now required careful consideration, as even minor mistakes could trigger consequences impossible to reverse. Leadership had to balance pragmatism with principle, and trust, once a given, was now continuously tested. Benjamin's role in this shifting environment remained defined by discipline and reliability. He did not seek recognition, and ambition had never motivated him beyond the need to. honor obligations. Yet the complexity of modern pressures demanded more than patience alone. Adaptation, foresight, and strategic observation were essential. Every action had to reinforce the trust others placed in him, while simultaneously mitigating exposure to forces beyond his control. Even as he maintained composure, the weight of these obligations was never far from his consciousness. Loyalty was not merely a choice, it was a compulsion embedded into identity, shaping thought, behavior, and emotion. Every interaction reinforced the reality that obligations in this world were not temporary, they were permanent. Extending far beyond the immediate context of any one decision, the past, present, and future were interlinked in ways that demanded constant attention, and every misstep could fracture a carefully balanced structure. Benjamin also recognized that some obligations were unseen, carrying consequences beyond immediate understanding. Promises made quietly years before could resurface unexpectedly, and actions taken with pure intent could create unforeseen complications. These chains of obligation were invisible yet tangible, shaping not only his life but the lives of everyone connected to him. Awareness, foresight, and patience were required in equal measure to navigate them. Despite these pressures, he remained committed to the code that defined him. Loyalty, discipline, and endurance were not optional, they were essential to survival and self-respect. Retreat was impossible, and compromise on principle was unthinkable. His strength lay in accepting the weight of obligations, understanding their permanence, and moving forward without hesitation, even when the path ahead was uncertain. The city around him reflected the fragility and resilience of this hidden world. Life went on with apparent normalcy, streetlights glowing, taxis moving, conversations spilling into the night, but beneath that veneer, complex dynamics shifted constantly. Economic pressures, generational changes, and social evolution created conditions where the old rules no longer guaranteed security. Every moment of stability had to be earned, maintained, and defended, often invisibly. Benjamin's awareness of these pressures had sharpened. He understood that endurance alone was no longer sufficient. Each step had to be deliberate, each choice calculated, each interaction observed with care. Even in silence, the consequences of past decisions and present obligations continued to accumulate, creating a tension that could never fully dissipate. And yet, he continued forward with quiet determination. Loyalty remained his guiding force, endurance his shield, and discipline his compass. Each invisible chain of obligation, no matter how heavy, was a testament to the life he had chosen and the principles he would not abandon. Because in a world built on trust, secrecy, and unspoken rules, to honor one's obligations is not just survival, it is identity itself. And the weight of that identity, though invisible, would shape every choice, every interaction, and every moment that lay ahead. In lives defined by secrecy and loyalty, decisions carry a resonance far beyond the moment they are made. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, each choice, no matter how small, had the power to shape outcomes that could stretch across years, touch countless people, and alter the fragile balance of power around him. In a world where words and actions were weighed for hidden meaning, the true impact of a decision often remained unseen until much later, leaving no room for error or hesitation. New York moved with its familiar rhythm, but for those who understood the hidden dynamics beneath the surface, the city's constant motion concealed a web of tension and uncertainty. Traffic, neon lights, and crowded sidewalks created a sense of normalcy that belied the underlying pressure of a world governed by loyalty, trust, and unspoken rules. The ordinary appearance of life contrasted sharply with the invisible battles taking place in quiet rooms, back offices, and private gatherings where power, influence, and survival intersected. Benjamin had long understood that his position demanded careful judgment. Every interaction, every statement, every gesture was subject to scrutiny by allies and adversaries alike. To remain effective, he had cultivated the ability to anticipate reactions, read unspoken intentions, and measure the consequences of actions before committing to them. Patience, observation, and discipline were not merely virtues, they were the instruments by which he navigated a complex, often dangerous world. The weight of decisions pressed on him continuously. Loyalty demanded that promises be honored regardless of personal cost. Trust required careful reinforcement through action, not merely words. Even routine tasks carried the potential for ripple effects, as a minor mistake could reveal vulnerabilities to those watching from outside the immediate circle. Benjamin had learned that in such an environment, discretion was as valuable as courage. and the consequences of visible action often outweighed the benefit of immediate gain. Law enforcement scrutiny had become increasingly precise. Investigations were no longer reactive but anticipatory, mapping networks of relationships and financial transactions with methodical care. Surveillance, subpoenas, and informants threatened to unravel the careful structures maintained for decades. For men like Benjamin, this shift meant that decisions were no longer confined to tactical maneuvers on the street. They now extended to matters of legality, perception, and survival under the law. Within private meetings, subtle tension had become the norm. Conversations were acanonical and deliberate, and even familiar associates were approached with caution. Facial expressions, pauses, and the weight of a single glance could convey meaning as much as words themselves. Benjamin observed these cues constantly, not merely for self-preservation, but to anticipate how decisions his own and others might echo through the interconnected web of obligations, loyalties, and rivalries. The personal cost of this vigilance was significant. Emotional fatigue settled quietly, a burden that could never be fully expressed. Family life remained a source of warmth and grounding, yet it existed alongside awareness that his responsibilities placed loved ones at indirect risk. Protecting them required emotional restraint, calculated distance, and a disciplined approach to interaction that preserved the boundaries between personal affection and professional obligation. Love and duty coexisted uneasily, each shaping the other without diminishing either. Decisions also carried moral weight, even in a world where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred. Benjamin understood that each choice affected more than his own life. It influenced the well-being of associates, family members, and even the communities touched indirectly by the organization. Loyalty demanded sacrifice, yet the ethical dimension of action remained present, a quiet reminder that consequences were never confined to a single individual. Every decision, therefore, demanded careful contemplation, weighing risk, reward, and principles simultaneously. The city itself mirrored these complexities. Everyday life proceeded with apparent routine, yet beneath the surface, power structures were shifting, alliances evolving, and the balance between risk and stability constantly recalculated. Economic change, demographic shifts, and the relentless pace of legal enforcement created an environment where decisions were never isolated. They intersected with multiple layers of consequence, often in unpredictable ways. Benjamin understood that foresight and adaptability were essential to survival, even for those who had mastered patience and discipline over decades. Despite these pressures, he continued forward with deliberate calm. Decisions were made not with haste or fear, but with careful consideration and full awareness of potential outcomes. His strength lay in the ability to act decisively while maintaining composure, ensuring that every step reinforced trust and loyalty. Those who relied on him did so because his judgment combined caution with courage, insight with discretion, and principle with pragmatism. Even as external pressures increased, Benjamin recognized that some decisions could not be delayed or avoided. Moments arose that demanded immediate response, whether to protect allies, preserve operations, or manage emerging threats. In such instances, hesitation was dangerous, yet impulsive action was equally perilous. Balancing these opposing forces required experience, intuition, and a capacity to carry the weight of consequences without faltering. The internal landscape of decision-making was complicated further by unseen factors. Past choices made quietly and often decades before could resurface with unexpected influence. Promises once made could generate obligations that demanded fulfillment under entirely new circumstances. Relationships forged in trust could be tested by shifting alliances or emerging scrutiny. Every decision had a temporal dimension, extending backward and forward in ways that could never be fully predicted. Benjamin's approach to these challenges reflected a lifetime of disciplined observation. He acted in accordance with principle while remaining adaptive to changing conditions. Each decision was considered in terms of both immediate impact and long-term consequences. Loyalty remained the guiding star, yet he recognized that survival required not only adherence to code but also awareness of the evolving realities surrounding him. Whispers of potential disruption traveled quietly through the network of associates. Observations, small adjustments in behavior, and subtle shifts in influence hinted at forces moving just beyond immediate perception. Benjamin interpreted these signals with care, knowing that one misjudged decision could trigger outcomes that would ripple far beyond his immediate control. Yet in spite of the weight of obligations, the pressure of scrutiny, and the unpredictability of the world around him, he continued forward with measured resolve. Decisions were made with deliberate clarity, grounded in loyalty, guided by principle, and tempered by experience. Each choice became a thread woven into the larger fabric of his life, a life defined by discipline, endurance, and unwavering commitment. In this world, every decision matters, every action echoes, and for Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the ability to navigate that reality with integrity, discretion, and patience remained the defining characteristic of both his survival and his identity, because in a life shaped by loyalty, the true measure of a man is not in the choices that are easy, but in the decisions he makes when everything he values hangs in the balance. And those decisions, though unseen by the public eye, carry the power to define a lifetime. In a world built on secrecy and loyalty, consequences often arrive quietly, long after the decisions that caused them were made. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, life had always been a careful balance between obedience, discretion, and endurance. Every choice, every act of trust, carried hidden weight, and the ripple of a single misstep could extend far beyond the moment it occurred. As the years advanced, it became increasingly clear that the shadows of consequence were growing longer, stretching across every aspect of his life. New York moved with relentless energy, its streets a blur of taxis, neon lights, and the constant rhythm of human activity. To the casual observer, life appeared normal, predictable even. But beneath the surface, the hidden currents of influence, power, and loyalty shifted continually. Every meeting, every exchange, every alliance carried implications that were invisible to most but crucial to those who operated within the clandestine structures of organized crime. Benjamin had long learned to perceive these subtle undercurrents, understanding that what was unseen often had far greater impact than what was visible. The legal environment had grown increasingly formidable. Investigations into organized crime were patient and meticulous, targeting not only individual acts but entire networks. The strategy was methodical: gather evidence slowly, map relationships carefully, and ensure that every prosecution had a foundation strong enough to withstand scrutiny. For men like Benjamin, this meant that the margin for error was narrower than ever. Even a minor misstep could trigger a chain reaction, and the consequences of exposure extended beyond personal freedom to affect family, associates, and the broader structure of operation. Within the private circles of the underworld, tension was pervasive. Trust still existed, but it was now constantly tested. Conversations were measured, interactions deliberate, and gestures laden with meaning. Long-standing allies observed one another carefully, understanding that a single lapse in judgment could signal vulnerability or betrayal. Benjamin navigated this environment with a combination of patience, observation, and quiet discipline, maintaining reliability while interpreting subtle cues that might indicate potential shifts in loyalty or alignment. Yet the weight of consequence was not limited to external threats. Internal pressures, cumulative over years, had created a silent strain that permeated every aspect of his life. Emotional vigilance was continuous, exhausting, and unrelenting. Each interaction carried layers of risk, and each decision demanded foresight beyond the immediate context. Even in moments of quiet reflection, Benjamin could feel the invisible weight of obligations, promises, and potential repercussions pressing against him. Family life offered moments of respite, but they were always tinged with awareness. Love and protection existed alongside the knowledge that proximity could increase vulnerability. Conversations, laughter, and shared routines were carefully balanced with discretion, ensuring that those closest to him remained shielded from dangers he could not fully control. This dual existence, personal warmth against professional vigilance, was a constant tension that few could truly comprehend. The broader criminal landscape was evolving in ways that increased pressure on individuals and organizations alike. Leadership required not only enforcement of traditional codes, but also adaptability to changing circumstances. Competition for influence, scrutiny from authorities, and shifts in social and economic structures demanded strategic insight. Decisions that once seemed straightforward now carried multiple layers of potential outcomes, and even the most experienced operatives could find themselves navigating terrain that was both familiar and perilous. Benjamin's approach to this environment remained consistent: steady observation, calculated decision-making, and unwavering loyalty. He recognized that endurance was not simply a personal trait, but a necessity for survival. Strength in this world required more than courage. It required patience, foresight, and the ability to bear consequences silently while maintaining outward composure. Those who relied on him trusted his judgment because it was anchored in principle, tempered by experience, and executed with precision. Consequences, however, were not always immediate. They often unfolded slowly, emerging from decisions made years before. Actions intended to protect, assist, or reinforce loyalty could resurface under new conditions, creating challenges unanticipated at the time. Even inaction carried implications, as failure to respond or adapt could trigger shifts in influence, trust, and security. Benjamin understood that in a world governed by hidden rules, consequences were inevitable, and preparation involved constant anticipation rather than reaction. The city itself reflected these tensions. Its motion, noise, and apparent continuity masked complex and evolving forces. Neighborhoods changed, economic pressures shifted, and social dynamics evolved, all contributing to an environment in which stability was fragile. Even the most carefully maintained networks of trust could be tested by external conditions beyond control. Awareness, vigilance, and adaptability were not optional, they were essential. Benjamin's life was a constant interplay between action and consequence. Every step was deliberate, measured, and informed by years of experience. Loyalty remained his guiding principle, yet he understood that even the purest devotion could not shield him from the long shadows cast by past decisions. Endurance, foresight, and discretion were tools he wielded daily, ensuring that the obligations he carried were fulfilled while mitigating potential risks. Despite the mounting pressures, he continued forward with quiet determination. Each decision, each act, and each gesture were executed with precision, guided by an understanding that consequences, though invisible, were always present. His strength lay in the ability to bear that weight without faltering, to navigate complexity without compromising principle, and to maintain loyalty, even when the cost was personal or uncertain. Whispers of change moved through hidden networks, subtle but persistent. Observations, minor adjustments in behavior, and quiet shifts in alliances indicated that consequences were approaching from multiple directions. Benjamin interpreted these signs carefully, preparing to respond with the same measured discipline that had allowed him to endure years of challenge. In a world where loyalty defines identity and secrecy shields existence, consequences are inevitable. They shape decisions, influence outcomes, and test the endurance of those who carry responsibility. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, understanding, anticipating, and accepting these shadows of consequence were as essential as loyalty itself. Because in a life governed by hidden rules, it is not the visible dangers that define a man, it is the weight he bears silently, the decisions he navigates carefully, and the consequences he endures without compromise. And in the quiet collision of choice and result, the true measure of endurance is revealed. In a world built on influence, secrecy, and loyalty, power is never absolute. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the structures that once seemed unshakable had begun to reveal their fragility. Each alliance, each arrangement, each carefully maintained relationship formed part of an intricate architecture, one whose stability depended on constant vigilance, discipline, and an awareness that even small tremors could destabilize the entire foundation. New York's streets moved with their familiar chaos, taxis honking, lights flickering across wet asphalt, voices echoing through alleyways. But for those attuned to the hidden currents of the underworld, the city was far from ordinary. Beneath the visible layers of commerce and routine, invisible structures of control and influence were constantly shifting. Every decision, every conversation, every unspoken gesture contributed to the fragile equilibrium of power. Benjamin had long learned to navigate these spaces with precision, understanding that endurance and discretion were as vital as strength. Law enforcement scrutiny had grown more systematic. Surveillance, informants, and meticulously documented evidence threatened the previously reliable shields of secrecy. Courtrooms had replaced the streets as the decisive battleground, where carefully constructed reputations and networks were challenged not with guns or threats, but with facts, testimony, and legal strategy. In this environment, the consequences of missteps could be immediate, public, and irrevocable. Within private circles, tension had become routine. Conversations were economical, deliberate, and loaded with meaning beyond the spoken words. Familiar faces carried cautious expressions, subtle hesitations in tone, and gestures that revealed far more than simple intent. Trust was no longer assumed. It required consistent reinforcement through action and observation. Benjamin's presence, steady and disciplined, became a stabilizing force precisely because he acted predictably and reliably, qualities increasingly rare in a climate of uncertainty. The weight of responsibility extended far beyond immediate interactions. Emotional fatigue, silent vigilance, and the constant need to anticipate consequences had created a subtle but unrelenting pressure. Every choice carried both practical and moral weight, as loyalty demanded sacrifices that were often invisible to those outside the network. Protecting loved ones required distance, discretion, and careful management of personal boundaries. The duality of public and private existence, of warmth and vigilance, defined much of his daily life. The broader criminal landscape was evolving under these pressures. Leadership required more than enforcement of tradition. It demanded strategic insight, adaptability, and foresight. Competition for influence, increased scrutiny from authorities, and subtle shifts in alliances created an environment where even the smallest miscalculation could have outsized consequences. Power was no longer maintained through fear alone. It required careful management of perception, relationships, and timing. Benjamin's approach remained methodical. He observed quietly, acted deliberately, and measured every decision against both immediate need and long-term consequence. Loyalty continued to guide his actions, yet he recognized that endurance and discretion were equally critical. Survival required balancing principle with pragmatism, action with restraint, and observation with intervention. Each choice contributed to the ongoing stability of an architecture built over decades, an architecture whose failure could be swift and devastating. The unseen fragility of power extended to relationships as well. Long-standing alliances were tested by suspicion, external pressure, and subtle shifts in influence. Promises made quietly years before could resurface under new conditions, creating obligations or conflicts that demanded careful navigation. Understanding the interplay of these forces and maintaining balance within them became an essential skill, one that required patience, awareness, and unwavering discipline. Even personal life carried echoes of this fragility. Family moments, though deeply valued, were intertwined with the knowledge that proximity could introduce risk. Conversations, laughter, and shared routines were preserved with care, but always tempered by awareness of external pressures. Protecting loved ones, maintaining trust, and honoring obligations demanded constant vigilance, a discipline that left no room for complacency. The city itself reflected the precarious nature of power. Its movement, its rhythms, and its apparent continuity masked the underlying instability of influence and control. Economic shifts, social changes, and generational transformations created an environment where structures once considered permanent were now subject to challenge. Even the most carefully maintained networks of authority could falter under pressure from forces beyond immediate perception. Benjamin's life was a constant negotiation with this fragility. Every action was deliberate, every decision informed by observation, and every interaction considered for its broader implications. Loyalty remained his compass, yet he understood that endurance alone was insufficient. Stability required foresight, adaptability, and the ability to respond to emerging threats without compromising principle. Whispers of subtle disruption moved through networks like a faint but persistent current. Minor adjustments in behavior, hidden alliances, and careful maneuvers hinted at forces operating just beyond immediate awareness. Benjamin interpreted these signals cautiously, preparing to respond while maintaining the appearance of consistency and calm. In a world where perception could determine outcomes as decisively as action, awareness and discretion were paramount. The architecture of power, though fragile, was not without strength. Its stability relied on the deliberate cultivation of loyalty, the careful management of relationships, and the unyielding discipline of those who held it together. Benjamin's endurance, insight, and reliability were integral to this structure, providing both protection and continuity. Each decision, carefully weighed, reinforced the balance between survival and principle, between influence and integrity. In such a world, even silence carries meaning. Observing without revealing, acting without unnecessary exposure, and maintaining composure under pressure became tools as essential as any weapon or strategy. Benjamin's life demonstrated that the true measure of strength is not in aggression or dominance, but in the capacity to sustain balance, uphold principle, and navigate complexity without faltering. And in this delicate interplay of loyalty, observation, and consequence. The fragile architecture of power endured, sustained by discipline, foresight, and the unwavering commitment of those like Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, whose endurance defined not only survival, but the very structure of the world in which they moved. Because in the shadows, power is never guaranteed. It is maintained by those capable of bearing its weight silently, navigating its complexity and understanding that even a small misstep can echo far beyond the immediate moment. And those who survive do so not by force alone, but by precision, patience, and the relentless discipline of awareness. In worlds governed by secrecy and trust, loyalty is a currency more valuable than gold, yet more dangerous than any weapon. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, loyalty had always been the anchor of his life, a principle that guided every choice, every word, every action. It was a force that earned respect, protected relationships, and defined identity. But in a reality where patience and discretion were tested daily, loyalty carried quiet consequences that were often heavier than anyone could anticipate. The city of New York moved with its familiar rhythm, streets buzzing with taxis, storefronts illuminated in neon, the constant flow of pedestrians. But beneath that energy lay a hidden framework of tension and unspoken observation. Life appeared normal to the outside world, yet those who understood the hidden network of influence and obligation could feel the subtle pressures tightening like an invisible net. Each decision, each promise, each demonstration of loyalty had the potential to trigger outcomes that would extend far beyond the immediate moment. Benjamin had long recognized the dual nature of loyalty. It was both protection, responsibility. Those who trusted him knew he would fulfill any promise, uphold every obligation, and maintain discretion even under extreme pressure. That reliability made him a cornerstone of the network he operated within. Yet every act of loyalty carried a price. The more deeply one committed to a code of honor, the more vulnerable one became to the shifting forces of power, legal scrutiny, and human unpredictability. Investigations into organized crime had grown relentless, patient, and precise. Federal authorities pursued patterns, mapped relationships, and collected evidence with a meticulousness that left little margin for error. The traditional shields of secrecy were being dismantled methodically. Courtrooms replaced the streets as arenas where influence and reputation were tested. The same loyalty that once ensured protection now carried risk. Actions once considered honorable could now be interpreted as complicity, and silence, once a shield, became a potential liability under scrutiny. Within private circles, loyalty was tested continuously. Allies who had been trusted for decades could suddenly appear uncertain. Gestures carried hidden meanings, and every word spoken was weighed for implication. Benjamin navigated these tensions with the same calm discipline that had defined him for years. He acted with careful observation, ensuring that his commitments were honored, while remaining vigilant to subtle shifts in trust, influence, and power. The consequences of loyalty extended beyond professional relationships into every facet of personal life. Emotional burden, quiet vigilance, and the constant pressure to anticipate danger created a subtle but relentless strain. Family interactions, though warm, were shadowed by the knowledge that proximity could increase risk. Protecting loved ones required restraint, careful management of boundaries, and a delicate balance between involvement and distance. In these moments, loyalty became a form of sacrifice, shaping both actions and emotions. The broader criminal landscape continued to evolve. Power was no longer solely enforced through fear or authority. Influence now required careful management of perception, strategic calculation, and an understanding of the long-term impact of every decision. Competition for territory, trust, and loyalty created pressures that demanded continuous attention. Benjamin recognized that in such a volatile environment, a single misjudgment could ripple outward, destabilizing even the most carefully maintained networks. Benjamin's approach to these pressures remained methodical. He observed silently, spoke selectively, and acted deliberately. Loyalty was the foundation, but it was tempered by foresight and discretion. Endurance, patience, and careful judgment were equally critical in navigating the hidden dynamics that defined survival. His reliability reinforced stability, yet he was fully aware that no amount of loyalty could guarantee safety when unseen forces were in motion. The city itself reflected this tension. Its vibrant energy, bustling streets, and constant rhythm masked a delicate equilibrium of influence and obligation. Neighborhoods shifted, alliances evolved, and structures once assumed permanent were now under constant challenge. Even the most disciplined men had to continuously reassess strategy, weigh trust, and anticipate consequences beyond immediate perception. For Benjamin, this required constant awareness, a steady hand, and an unwavering commitment to principle. The weight of loyalty was often quiet, unseen by the public eye, yet pervasive in its effect. Every action taken in its name created connections, obligations, and potential vulnerabilities. Promises made decades earlier could resurface unexpectedly. Alliances thought secure could falter under pressure. Silence, though protective, could also expose hidden truths. The consequences of loyalty were never straightforward. They were intricate, far-reaching, and often unavoidable. Benjamin's endurance was tested not only by external threats, but by the emotional and ethical implications of his commitments, moral dilemmas, complex human relationships, and the constant tension between protection and risk required a level of discipline few could sustain. Loyalty demanded sacrifice not just of immediate comfort, but of long-term security, emotional ease, and sometimes even personal freedom. Despite these challenges, Benjamin moved forward with clarity and resolve. His actions were deliberate, guided by principle, and tempered by experience. Each choice reinforced trust, honored obligations, and maintained discretion. Even when the weight of potential consequences was heavy, he remained unwavering. The quiet strength of his loyalty, disciplined and precise, became both shield and compass, guiding him through a world where stability was fragile and trust could never be assumed. Whispers of change circulated subtly within networks of influence. Minor shifts in behavior, the emergence of new alliances, and subtle realignments indicated that consequences were unfolding from multiple directions. Benjamin interpreted these signs carefully, preparing to respond without exposing vulnerability or compromising principle. In this environment, perception was as crucial as action, and silence often spoke louder than words. Ultimately, loyalty in this world was both identity and responsibility. It defined relationships, shaped decisions, and determined survival. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero understood that the true cost of loyalty was not always visible. It was carried quietly in the choices made, the actions withheld, and the burdens endured without recognition. Because in a life governed by trust, discipline, and hidden rules, the consequences of loyalty are never immediate, never obvious, and never simple. They unfold slowly, quietly, and with a weight that touches every aspect of existence, testing endurance, judgment, and the strength of principle itself. And those who bear this weight without faltering reveal the true measure of character, courage, and unwavering devotion to the code that defines their world. In the hidden layers of life ruled by loyalty, discretion, and unspoken codes, endurance is more than persistence, it is survival. For Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, endurance had long been the guiding force, the quiet engine that allowed him to navigate challenges, uncertainty, and danger with steadiness and precision. Yet as time passed and circumstances shifted, the nature of endurance itself was tested in ways that demanded not only patience but insight, judgment, and resilience beyond the ordinary. New York streets flowed with their usual motion, taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through traffic, the hum of life carrying on uninterrupted. To the casual observer, the city was simply alive, energetic, and unchanging. Yet beneath this surface, forces invisible to most were constantly reshaping the landscape. Alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and legal scrutiny grew sharper, leaving little room for error. Every step taken, every conversation held, and every act of discretion carried consequences that could extend far beyond immediate perception. Endurance, Benjamin understood, was not passive. It required constant vigilance, observation, and adjustment. The patience that had served him for years was now paired with a need to anticipate and respond to forces that were fluid, unpredictable, and often hidden. Loyalty, while unshakable in principle, became a tool that demanded careful navigation, protecting allies, maintaining relationships, and preserving stability within networks of influence required more than simple adherence to the code. It required awareness, calculation, and strategic foresight. The weight of responsibility pressed continuously. Benjamin's reliability had long been recognized as a stabilizing factor in a volatile environment. Associates and leaders depended on him not only for his adherence to principle, but for his judgment under pressure. Yet even as his reputation provided authority, it also carried vulnerability. The more indispensable one appeared, the greater the consequences of any mistake. Every action was scrutinized, every omission analyzed, and every decision became part of a complex web of influence and obligation. In private moments, The emotional and mental demands of this life revealed themselves. Quiet reflection, once a source of balance, now carried undertones of concern and fatigue. Protecting loved ones meant constant calculation, ensuring that personal interactions did not inadvertently create exposure. Family and friendship, though deeply valued, existed alongside an awareness that proximity could increase risk. Love required restraint, vigilance, and sometimes emotional distance, a paradox Benjamin had accepted as part of the life he had chosen. The broader criminal landscape was evolving. Law enforcement had become proactive, methodical, and technologically sophisticated. Networks previously hidden behind layers of loyalty and secrecy were now subject to detailed surveillance, financial tracking, and meticulous investigation. The rules that had once guided operations fear, intimidation, discretion were supplemented by a legal system capable of dismantling structures with patience, strategy, and precision. For men like Benjamin, endurance now meant navigating these dual pressures, maintaining loyalty and secrecy while anticipating the relentless, methodical attention of authorities. Within this shifting environment, interpersonal dynamics were equally complex. Trust, once assumed among long-standing allies, required continual reinforcement. Subtle changes in behavior, tone, or interaction could signal uncertainty, hesitation, or even betrayal. Benjamin had developed a keen sense for reading these signs, interpreting nuance, and responding with the appropriate level of caution or action. Each interaction was measured, deliberate, and executed with the awareness that misjudgment could have cascading effects. Even seemingly routine decisions carried weight. Minor choices in behavior, conversation, or association could ripple outward, affecting relationships, stability, and long-term influence. The patience, foresight, and discipline Benjamin applied daily were essential tools in managing these consequences. Loyalty remained his guiding principle, but endurance now encompassed far more. The capacity to remain steady in the face of evolving threats, uncertainty, and moral complexity. Time itself became a factor. Past actions, often guided by principle, sometimes resurfaced under changed circumstances, creating obligations or consequences unanticipated at the time. Silence, which had been protective for decades, occasionally became a liability under scrutiny. Every promise, every commitment, and every act of discretion was part of a continuum where endurance meant understanding both immediate impact and long-term ramifications. Benjamin's strength lay not only in his ability to persist, but in his capacity to adapt while maintaining principle. The city mirrored these dynamics. Its apparent consistency, its streets, businesses, and routines belied underlying instability. Social, economic, and generational shifts created pressures on networks of influence, requiring constant recalibration. Stability was never static, it had to be actively maintained. For those like Benjamin, understanding the patterns, anticipating change, and acting with precision were essential to survival. Endurance was not passive, it was active, requiring intellect, vigilance, and a disciplined temperament. Within his world, Benjamin also understood the importance of timing. Acting too soon or too late could produce unforeseen consequences. Observation, careful calculation, and strategic decision-making became as vital as loyalty itself. Each choice was weighed not only for immediate effect, but for its reverberation across relationships, obligations, and potential legal exposure. In this environment, endurance was the skill of balancing patience with action, caution with courage, and principle with pragmatism. The personal dimension of endurance was equally demanding. Emotional fatigue, moral complexity, and constant vigilance created pressure that few outside the hidden world could understand. Protecting loved ones while fulfilling obligations required constant negotiation between risk and care. Moments of intimacy and comfort were always paired with the knowledge that exposure could come from any direction. Benjamin's life was defined by the quiet discipline of maintaining equilibrium in the face of invisible forces. Even as these pressures intensified, his approach remained consistent. Observation, patience, and deliberate action guided every step. Loyalty anchored him, discipline sustained him, and insight allowed him to anticipate challenges before they became crises. Endurance in this context was the combination of moral steadfastness and practical acumen, a capacity to act decisively without abandoning principle or clarity of thought. Whispers of change, subtle and persistent, traveled through networks of influence. Minor shifts in alliances, hidden signals in behavior, and emerging external pressures indicated that new challenges were approaching. Benjamin read these signs carefully, preparing to respond while maintaining composure, discretion, and adherence to principle. In this world, perception and patience were as vital as action. Ultimately, endurance is not measured by the absence of challenge, but by the capacity to persist in the face of it. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had spent decades mastering this skill, navigating a shifting landscape with loyalty, discipline, and insight. The challenges he faced were complex, relentless, and often invisible, yet his commitment to principle, careful observation, and measured action allowed him to remain a stabilizing force in a volatile environment. Because in a life governed by hidden rules, true endurance is revealed not in moments of triumph or recognition, but in the quiet, consistent ability to navigate uncertainty, maintain loyalty, and carry the weight of consequences without faltering. And those who master this art, who remain steady while the world shifts around them, define not only their survival, but the enduring strength of the structures and principles they uphold.